Okay, so up next, we're going to talk about the samplers in Live. Now, remember, let's go way back to the beginning of this part of this class. We talked about our four main things, right? Uh, Oscillators, filters, envelopes, amplifier, okay? Now, here's the cool thing about samplers. All of that's the same. It's totally the same. Except the only thing that's different is that our oscillator section can hold an actual audio file. Rather than just giving us waveforms, it's going to give us an audio file. But the rest is the same. Filters, envelopes, amplifiers, all that stuff is the same. So we have two main samplers in Live. We have what's called the sampler, and we have what's called the simpler. Okay? Now, if you said to yourself, well, it sounds like the simpler is a simple version of the sampler, you would get a gold star for the day, because that is correct. We're using simplers all over, and we've seen simplers all over. All of these in drum racks, these are all simpler instruments. Okay? So we'll go into how all this works in a second. Let's actually just load a simpler onto a new track right now. Okay? Here we go. So here's an empty simpler. Our oscillator section is going to be this big sample area here. But then, as you will be familiar with seeing, we have filter. Here's frequency and resonance, filter shapes, and even a filter button to turn it on and off. We have an LFO. You know what that is. And we have these four buttons right here, which are probably familiar to you by now. Attack, decay, sustain, release. That's our ADSR envelope. Okay, and then we have a big old volume knob here. Now we have some other controls that we can get at. More filters, a bigger LFO, and some more controls for our envelope. But all of that stuff should be pretty familiar to you by now. So, let's dive into the simpler. I want to talk about the simpler kind of runs in three different modes. So let's talk about that in the next few videos, and then we'll go into sampler. Okay, so I have a simpler here. Let's load a sample into it. We can load a sample into it from all over the place. If we have a sample that we like in our session, we can just click and drag it down there. Or we can go to our samples here. That's kind of cool. Let's drag that down there. We're just going to plop it right on this dark area. All right, and there we have it. Okay, so the three different modes of simpler. Classic mode means that we now have a sample and we can trigger that sample. And it's going to, by default, not loop the sample, but we can loop it. This is quite a long sample. We can build a loop in this. We've got some warp controls here. We can fade this out. So that's a little smoother. And see how it loops. That's cool. Okay. So if we play a note and just keep our finger down on the note, it's going to loop back. We can turn that off here. The note is also going to, the note that we play on our MIDI keyboard is going to transpose this sound. So the default is always middle C. If I play middle C, which is not that, then it's going to go back to its original pitch. We can't easily change what that original pitch is. In simpler, you just kind of have to remember that whatever pitch I put into that sample is not going to be the pitch that comes out when I play it on a keyboard. Okay, it's not really designed for that. With sampler, we can do that, but with simpler, we don't really do that. So So I'm playing a C here. I don't know what pitch this is. Actually, I do. It is also a C, but live doesn't know what pitch it is. So if I play up a whole step, it's just going to transpose it up a whole step, regardless of what the actual pitch is. Okay, so quite simple. If I want to adjust my frequency, resonance, I can do that there. My envelope, I can make the attack less forceful and have it kind of fade in with that. Can adjust the volume. Pretty simple, right? It is pretty simple. It's going to play our file. That's really kind of all it's going to do. Okay, let's go to one-shot mode. Okay, when we switch over to one-shot mode, we have a little bit fewer settings actually here. The main two we have is trigger and gate, okay? So if I'm on trigger, that means when I say play that note, it's going to play that note, and it's not going to loop. Okay, I'm still holding my finger down. It just stops. That's cool. I could still use my ADSR, although it works a little bit differently. It's giving me like a fade in and a fade out kind of point. I've got a transposition here that I can use. How much the velocity that I play is converted to volume. Let's say a lot. That means that if I play my keyboard quietly, it's going to play the note quietly. And if I play it hard, it's going to play it really hard. But you might not want that. You might just want it so that it always plays the same volume every time. Okay? It is still going to transpose based on what note I play. But back to this triggering gate. Gate means it's going to play the note as long as I'm holding the note down. It's going to play that sample. But as soon as I let go, it's going to stop playing that sample. So in trigger, I'm going to hit a note, and that's just basically going to say, play that sample, like fire, play that sample, no matter what. In gate, it's going to say, when I'm holding my finger down, the gate is open to play, but when I lift my finger up, the gate stops. Okay? Relatively simple. Same filter settings, nothing too crazy. Okay, let's go to the more fun one, slice. Okay, so in slice mode, it's going to let us chop up this sample a little bit. Now, this isn't a great one for this. Let's find like a... Let's actually use this banjo loop. Okay, so in slice mode, you see that it automatically has grabbed all these different transients, okay? And when I play MIDI notes, it's going to assign one MIDI note per slice, okay? Now this is kind of like Slice the New MIDI track, except it's keeping everything in one simpler rather than divvying it out to a whole bunch of simplers. Okay, so this is really fun for just finding new sounds. There's all kinds of fun stuff here. So we're ignoring the pitch that I play. It's not transposing this anymore. It's just using this to trigger all of these different points. So you can set how it slices it. You can say slice by transient, beat, region, or manual. But even if you set it to transient, which is usually the best way, you can adjust these transients. Move them where you want them. We have warp settings still, and we have warp modes that we can activate here. Fade in, fade out. I believe this will apply to each one. filter, frequency, and resonance. So basically, this is most useful on like a beat. Like if we take a beat, now I can find like this kick. There's the snare. Right, so now I can just kind of take the beat and play it really simply. Okay, so that's what slice will let you do. It's just going to let you chop things up and trigger things by transient rather than the whole sample. Okay, let's switch over to the sampler and look at how it's different. So instruments, sampler. Okay, so sampler is a bit more complicated, and for one reason. I mean, it gives you more control over the samples, but it also lets you load multiple samples in. So we'll look at how and why you would do that in just a minute. But first, let's just look at the main interface. Let's take one of our presets here. Okay, so here's what this sounds like. Terrifying. Okay, so we have this whole sample here, but we're looping just this section. We can do what's called a sustain mode here. So this one means it's going to just play and then stop. This one means it's going to basically loop. This one is called a boomerang loop, where it's going to play forward and then backwards and forwards and then backwards and forwards and backwards. That sometimes makes a more seamless loop. So we do have more tuning controls of our sample here. So we can see like a list of the samples available to us here. We can reverse it. We can set here what the root note of this sample is. Now that's important because that's something big that we can't do in Simpler. So once we set the root note correctly, that means that everything will line up on your keyboard correctly. So if I load in a sample that is a sound that's in a D sharp, sure, then when I play a C on my keyboard, it's going to play it as a D sharp. That's going to be all weird. But if I change the root note here to say D sharp, then Live knows how to transpose the thing correctly to play the right note at the right time. So if you're dealing with pitched samples, and building harmonies and things, then having the root note correct is important. Okay, look just here at like crossfade and loop end. What we're seeing here is like number of samples, right? Like this is very, very specific that we can do here. The crossfade settings, the loop length, and all of these are unique per sample that we're looking at, right? They're going to reset for the different samples. We can detune it. All of these things are pretty familiar to us. If we go over here, we've got some ADSR controls over here. We've got a pitch envelope over here with another ADSR. We've got filters. These are global, so these are going to affect everything, not just they're going to affect all the samples, not just the one we're using it. Some modulation settings if we want to do some LFOs. We've got 3 of them available to us, and then we can do some more complicated MIDI mapping if we really want to. But the star of the show is this zones tab right here. So let's go to a new video and dive into what zones means in a sampler. Okay, so maybe you've seen before sample libraries that you can buy online. There's tons of them. Maybe you've seen like an orchestra library, like you want a good sounding orchestra that you can queue up and use. That's great. You've probably seen orchestra libraries that cost $100, and you've seen orchestra libraries maybe that cost $1,000. And maybe you've seen an orchestra library that costs $10. Why? What is the difference? There are a few things. There's the quality of the recordings. There's how the samples have been edited and put together. But one of the main things that separates those is how many samples there are, right? Because if I record a violin playing a note, a single note, and I put that into a sampler, and then I transpose it down 4 octaves, that's not going to sound like a bass, right? It's not. It's going to sound funny and weird. You've done this before. Take your voice, transpose it down an octave, and it doesn't sound like someone with a deeper voice than you. It sounds funny. Take your voice and go up an octave. Does it sound like you up an octave? No, it sounds like Mickey Mouse, right? So the way we avoid that is we have a sample at, let's use the voice thing. Let's keep going with that. We have a sample of my voice where it is, and then another sample of my voice of me talking up an octave. And then the computer knows when to switch. So each one is only transposed a little bit, and then it switches to the other sample. So it might transpose up a couple steps, my voice, my original voice, but then it reaches a threshold where instead of transposing it more, it goes to the higher one and transposes that down because it can do that less steps of transposition. So the more samples that are in it, the better. You can also have volume. You could say that if I whisper really quiet, then it's a certain timbre, right? And if I take that sound and just turn the volume way up on it, you're not going to get the timbre of me yelling, right? You should have 2 separate sounds that know, 2 separate files that know, and the sampler that knows when to use the right one based on the velocity of the note I press. That's what all this has to do with, okay? So if we go into zones, what we see in this particular instrument is 5 samples. And you can see they're different octaves, F1, F2, F3, F4, and F5, okay? Now this matrix type thing over here tells us when to use each sample. So if I play a note that is C2 and under, it's going to use this sample. If I play a note between C2 and C3, it's going to use this one, C3 and C4, C4 and C5, and then C5 and up, it's going to use this one. Each of these only have to transpose about an octave. We also have velocity controls here where we can set the same thing. Now this one hasn't set it. This one has not set velocity controls, so all of the notes are going to be on in the same velocity. But only one note, one sample can play at a time. Okay, so if I play a note, it's right on the edge, huh? Okay, let's go there. So this is playing that sample. You can see with red which note I'm playing. But if I go down, still the same sample. Now we've switched to a different file. Okay, so a good sample library is put together in this way with tons of files. The more files, the bigger the sampler is, and generally speaking, the better, more realistic it sounds if it's an acoustic instrument. So each of these is called a zone. There are different zones for each sample, and you can set them up to trigger in different ways. We're going to see this very similar thing when we talk about instrument racks in just a minute. But before we do that, let's open an orchestra library and let me show you what a big orchestra library looks like. Okay, so I'm going to close all of this by going to this zones tab again. And now let's look at the Ableton Orchestra. So the quickest way to get to that is to go to packs. And you have to have this one installed for it to work, but orchestra strings, Let's go to string ensemble, legato. This is a pretty nice sounding orchestra. Now, the real big orchestra libraries will not transpose your files at all. They will have a single file for every note and probably 5 or 6 different velocities of that note, different volumes of that note. This one does transpose somewhat, and it is in multi-sample mode. So this is a little bit of a weird live trick. But basically, when you see this multi-sample mode, if you want to get into it and really work with it, control click on the header part up here and go down to simpler to sampler. And it's basically going to take it out of multi-sample mode and switch it back over into a sampler. I'm not really sure why that some things come up that way, but it basically turns it back into a sampler, which is what it needs to be. Okay, so let's go on zones. You can see there's 300 samples in this instrument. So if we go up to zones, we see all these files. Okay, and actually, yeah, this one has single files. So if we go to right in the middle, let's say this one. So this file plays for note, let's see, what is that? C sharp 5 only. Okay, so this file is just doesn't transpose at all. If I play C5, it triggers this file. Okay, so now you'll also see that it actually triggers it 4 times. Why would that be? I'll explain that to you. So if I play C sharp 5, these 4 notes are going to get triggered. However, the velocity setting is going to stop them. So here's that same note, okay? If I play a low velocity, it's going to play this one. If I play a little bit higher velocity, it's going to play that one, a little higher and a little higher. So for every single note in the range of the orchestra, we have an audio file of that note 4 times at 4 different volumes, okay, from quiet to loud. So this setup is going to be able to tell live that when I play this note at a certain volume, which note to trigger. So you can build these. You can build these very easily by just dragging sounds into a sampler and building up a whole library this way. And you know, you can buy some of these samplers. If you have something like Contact, that's a sample player that does the same thing. It's able to handle a ton of different samples, and you can push them. You can set up a system where it decides which one to play, and that's where you get big sample libraries. Contact is free, but the libraries that you will buy for it are decidedly not sometimes. Okay, so that's how Zones works in a big orchestra library. And this one sounds pretty good. It's a pretty decent sounding library. All right, let's add a sampler to our crazy track here. What I want is something kind of keyboard-like to help reinforce this sound. So let's go to sampler and look at some of the presets. Something with kind of a quick attack. That's kind of interesting. It might not work for us though. No, there's whole chords in there, so I don't want that. That's kind of fun. Let's try that. So we'll take all of this and put it down here to double it. Let's hear what that sounds like. I don't really love it. We try that. Too big. I kind of like it. Cool, whatever. This thing's kind of ridiculous, but I'll give you this session again. I think we've added a few layers since we've last given it to you. So if it's fun for you, you can download it and play around with it if you like. And then let's move on to racks.